Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. We're watching a country that still sells itself as the champion of free markets, while quietly converting its entire economic policy into a permanent emergency regime. In public, Washington talks about national security, protecting American workers, containing authoritarian rivals. In practice, it's tariffs, sanctions, export bans, and subsidies stapled together into a new religion. Made in USA, by coercion, not by competition. And the bill for this heroism is landing not on Wall Street, but in the monthly budget of the American middle class. Here is one simple number. The trade in goods between the US and China is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars per year. You cannot sanction that away without structural consequences. Every tariff that looks like a punch to Beijing is, at the same time, a quiet tax on the American consumer and on everyone who built their supply chains around cheap Asian production. And this is where the official story falls apart. Let's start with physics and money, not speeches. For 30 years, the US built its prosperity on a very simple deal. Design, finance, and branding stay in America. Mass production moves to where labor is cheap, regulations are softer, and environmental costs are someone else's problem. Containers come back full of electronics, cars, solar panels, furniture, you name it. The middle class gets lower prices. Corporations get higher margins. Politicians get GDP and a calm voter. Now the same political class is trying to sell a different story. We will break dependence on China, protect our workers, rebuild industry, punish Beijing, and somehow keep Walmart prices the same. That combination does not exist in nature. In short, the math doesn't care about ambition. When the White House announces new tariffs on Chinese EVs and solar panels, the soundbite is simple. We are defending American jobs and national security. But structurally, tariffs do three things at once. They raise import prices. They give local producers breathing space from competition. And they tempt every lobbyist in Washington to crawl in and ask, if they get protection, where is mine? Tariffs are rarely surgical. They spread like mold through the whole system. Take the electric vehicle story. On paper, the US wants a green transition, more EVs, cleaner air, fewer emissions. At the same time, it wants to block Chinese EVs that are often cheaper and in some segments ahead on price to quality. So you get a triple structure: tariffs and non-tariff barriers on Chinese brands, subsidies and tax credits for US-made or friendly EVs, and a consumer who is told that paying more is patriotism. Here's the part economists fear. You can protect an industry for a while, but you cannot decree competitiveness. If your cost structure is higher, your energy is more expensive, and your industrial workforce has been hollowed out for decades, tariffs buy you time. They do not magically recreate the ecosystem you dismantled. Solar panels, same script. For years, Western governments loved cheap Chinese solar because it made their climate targets look realistic on paper. Then someone noticed that depending on one supplier for the backbone of your green revolution is a strategic risk. So Washington moves to restrict imports, talk about forced labor, subsidize domestic manufacturing. The result is predictable. Panels become more expensive, deployment slows, and suddenly, the 10-year transition quietly becomes maybe 20 if nothing breaks. Let's talk about chips for a moment. The US still dominates in chip design, tools, and some high-end manufacturing. But the supply chain is deeply interlocked with Asia. Export controls on advanced semiconductors and manufacturing equipment are presented as a clean win. We limit China's military and AI capabilities. In reality, you are forcing global companies to redesign supply chains, split product lines, navigate a legal minefield, and accept higher costs. The strategic logic may be understandable. The economic cost is unavoidable. So let's take a breath. Where are we now? We have the US entering a long economic war with China on three main fronts: tariffs on goods, EVs, solar, steel, aluminum, etc. Export controls on high-end tech, chips, tools, AI hardware, and industrial policy at home, subsidies, tax credits, buy American rules. At the same time, household budgets are already under pressure from higher housing costs, medical bills, and years of inflation spikes. You cannot keep stacking hidden taxes on imported goods and pretend it's free. Here's the number nobody likes to mention. For most American households, 50 to 70% of monthly spending goes into non-discretionary items: housing, food, transport, healthcare, utilities. That is exactly where imported deflation from China was hiding the rot in the system. Cheap clothes, cheap electronics, cheap household goods and tools, partially compensated for insane rents and medical bills. If you start deliberately making the cheap side of the basket more expensive, all the structural problems you were masking come back in full color. Inside the US, there are three conflicting logics. The industrial lobby wants protection and subsidies. From their perspective, tariffs on Chinese competition and federal money for new factories are not ideology, they're survival. They look at decades of offshoring, see their towns dying, and say, either we bring production back or we become a museum. The financial and IT capital wants global chains and open markets. They built entire business models on the assumption that manufacturing is modular and movable, that you can assemble a phone from 20 countries and ship it wherever you want. For them, fragmentation of the world into blocks is a direct attack on margins and on the scalability of their models. The voter wants an impossible combo: cheap goods, secure jobs, geopolitical dominance, and moral superiority. America first, but without higher prices and without sacrifice. Does this look like strategy or managed decline? There is one phrase nobody in Washington likes to say out loud. Tariffs are a tax on your own population. It's much more pleasant to call them pressure on Beijing or protection of national security. But when a container with EVs or electronics crosses the border, the tariff is not paid by the Chinese government. It's paid by the importer, then passed to the retailer, and finally lands in the price tag you see in the shop. You can wrap it in any flag you like. The mechanism doesn't change. Now add geopolitics. The US is not just reacting to China's rise. It is trying to freeze the current hierarchy of the system. Dollar in the center, American control over critical technologies, and a network of allies who accept US rules even when it hurts them. That is why every trade decision now comes with a security label. EVs become a security risk. Cranes in ports become a security risk. Even cheap apps and consumer gadgets become potential Trojan horses. From Washington's perspective, this makes sense. If you admit China as an equal industrial and technological power, you are admitting that the era of uncontested American primacy is over. Politically, no one in DC wants to sign that paper. But this is where theory hits a brick wall. The rest of the world does not freeze for your convenience. China is not sitting and waiting to see what tariff comes next. It is building its own markets, its own standards, its own financial channels. The more aggressively the US weaponizes trade and technology, the stronger the incentive for others to create parallel systems. If you're watching from Europe, by the way, your reality is even more absurd. Brussels talks about de-risking from China, waves the same security language, and then quietly discovers that its own energy transition, industrial base, and export model depend both on China and on access to the US market. You get the comedy of European politicians lecturing Beijing while their own companies beg not to be cut off from Chinese demand. This is the flaw you can't fix with PR. Let's zoom out for a second. What we have is a global system that was built for efficiency, long chains, just-in-time logistics, lowest-cost production, suddenly being run as if it were a war economy. The US is at the center of this shift. It still prints the main reserve currency. It still commands the core of the financial plumbing. It still has unmatched military reach. But in terms of production capacity, it is deeply entangled with the same rival it wants to contain. From here, all options are bad. The only question is who pays first. If Washington goes soft on tariffs and controls, it looks weak at home and gives Beijing more room to grow into high-value sectors. If it goes hard, it hurts its own companies, its own allies, and its own voters through higher prices and slower growth. There is no button that says, punish China, keep target prices unchanged, reindustrialize Ohio, save the climate, and maintain global hegemony. So what does this look like on the ground for ordinary people? Higher prices for anything that has a complex supply chain. More national security excuses for why your bill is larger this year. More headlines about historic investments in factories that will take years to build and may or may not be competitive. More political speeches about rebuilding the middle class, while that same middle class quietly pays for the tariffs, the subsidies, and the interest on the growing federal debt. You see the problem here, right? When a system relies on cheap foreign production to paper over its own structural inequality, then declares that foreign production a national security threat, it has two honest options. Either it reduces internal inequality and cost pressures, or it accepts that living standards will fall for part of the population. The U.S. political class is trying a third way: pretend that tariffs will magically make everything better without trade-offs. That fantasy has an expiration date. There is also a long-term trust issue. For decades, the U.S. sold the rest of the world an ideology: open markets, rule-based trade, no discrimination, private property is sacred. Now the message is different. Markets are open when it suits us. Rules are flexible, and your assets, contracts, and access can be switched off if we decide you are a threat. Technologically and militarily, Washington still has the leverage to do it. But every time it uses that lever, it teaches others to build exits. This is not about sympathy for Beijing. It's about basic system logic. If you repeatedly show that the world's biggest economy is willing to override its own rules for political reasons, you downgrade the credibility of those rules. That hits the dollar's status, the willingness to hold U.S. assets, and the readiness to accept American regulation of global finance and tech. If you're sitting in Asia, Africa, or Latin America, you may dislike parts of China's behavior and still conclude that diversification is rational. Relying on one center of power that openly calls you collateral in its domestic game is not a smart strategy. In the end, this new economic war is not just U.S. versus China. It is the U.S. versus the limits of its own system. You cannot outsource your industrial base for decades, build a society on cheap imports, inflated asset prices, and debt, and then suddenly decide that you will fight an industrial rival while keeping everything at home unchanged. The slogans are simple. The physics is not. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember, slogans don't power grids. Systems do.